In an attempt to return to where do we go from here, we have several videos on this particular book. I'm picking up pretty deep into the book. Chapter 3, Racism and White Backlash. This is the chapter. Page 71. And where I'm going to be pulling from is page 80 moving forward. I am in the midst of writing a book about Abraham Lincoln and the Lincoln administration, and specifically speaking about the recognition of Haiti and Liberia, and how that recognition is a much more significant event in history than previously focused on. We'll find that recognition is evidence of the central focus of Lincoln's politics, or I saw it put better by another author, that their wording was really, really good. But it was just showing, it was a way of articulating that what was in the middle, what was the core element of Lincoln's politics. And it was colonization, not necessarily because he hated black people, but because that's what would save the Union in his estimation, because he felt slavery was a system that was tearing apart the Union, hence the Civil War. And in doing that, as much as I always recommend this book for anyone and everyone that profess to admire Dr. Martin Luther King, read what he actually said and what he wrote, not what someone tells you that he said, thought, and wrote. And in this, I have found not just an accurate depiction of the thoughts of Martin Luther King, a primary source of the civil rights movement as we know it, but a historical resource. That on page 81, he says Abraham, he was speaking about George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, John Quincy Adams, John Calhoun, and Abraham Lincoln were all great men, but that but underscores the fact that not one of these men had a strong, unequivocal belief in the quality of the black man, on the equality of the black man. It's important to know. No one doubts the valor and commitment that characterized George Washington's life, or Abraham Lincoln's in my case. But to the end of his days, he maintained a posture of exclusionism toward the slave. He was a fourth generation slave owner, and that's when he's talking about George Washington. And he only allowed Negroes into the Continental Army because His Majesty's Crown was attempting to recruit Negroes in the British Army. That is no different than what Abraham Lincoln did in the Civil War. It was not that the South was recruiting slaves, but the slaves were already part of the Confederates, because that was their property in which things were being moved, carried, and assisted. As he searched, again, still talking about Washington, I wish from my soul that the legislature of this state could see the policy of gradual abolition of slavery. It might prevent much future mischief. In spite of this, Washington never made a public statement condemning slavery. As we keep going, Thomas Jefferson, in his notes on Virginia, Jefferson portrayed the Negro as inferior to the white man. Now really coming to my area. As early as 1837, as a state legislator, Lincoln referred to the injustice and impracticality of slavery. Now, this was something that he was against, not necessarily because of a desire for equality or a sensitivity to the situations and circumstances of people that were descendants of Africans. It was because of a personal experience that he had where he was rented out and for work, but the money went to his father. So and this is something he expressed. So he always had a problem with, he had an economic issue with slavery, not a moral one. And this was something that he articulated. In fact, he had said at some points in his life, he saw himself as a slave. Later, he wrote, the physical differences between blacks and whites made it clear that he felt whites were superior. At times, he concluded that the white man could not live with the Negro. This accounted for his conviction that the only answer to the problem was to colonize the black man, send him back to Africa or to the West Indies or some other isolated spot. This view was still in his mind toward the height of the Civil War. Delegation after delegation, the Quakers above all, great abolitionists like Sumner Greeley and William Lloyd Garrison. Be careful when you say great abolitionists when you talk about William Lloyd Garrison. There's more to that story if you read this book right here with his interaction with Frederick Douglass. A lot of information about William Lloyd Garrison. A lot of people thought slavery was wrong. They did not necessarily feel that equality was right. So I always know the whole story. And in fact, it said William Lloyd Garrison pleaded with Lincoln to free the slaves, but he was firm in his resistance. Frederick Douglass, a Negro of towering grandeur, sound judgment, and militant initiative, sought without success to persuade Lincoln that slavery, not merely the preservation of the Union, was at the root of the war. And at the time, Lincoln could not yet see it. Lincoln was basically honest and willing to admit his confusions. He saw that the nation would not survive half slave and half free. And he said, if we could first know where we are and whither we are tending, we could better judge what to do and how to do it. Fortunately, the nation he finally came to see, whether we are tending, on January 1st, 1863, issued the Emancipation Proclamation freeing the Negro from bondage and chattel slavery. By the concrete act of courage, his reservations of the past were overshadowed. Now, we not only get to learn a lot about Lincoln, but we get to learn a lot about Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was way smarter than me, bottom line. Genius by all aspects. But there are things that I feel that he was historically mistaken on. And his perpetuation of the great emancipator persona associated with Lincoln is incorrect. None of Abraham Lincoln's policies condemn slavery. Not the Emancipation Proclamation, not the 13th Amendment. They only compromised them. They only negotiated them. In each one, there was an allowance for slavery to be continued. There is a big difference in abolishing and changing. There was a change from slavery prior to 1805 to chattel slavery that went from 1805 to 1865. So just like that change from the slaves being commodified in 1805, there was a change from the slave being criminalized in 1865. So when people make statements like, the conclusion of his search is embodied in these words, "In giving freedom to the slave, we assured freedom to the free, honorable alike is what we give and what we preserve." The significance of the Emancipation Proclamation was described by Frederick Douglass in these words: "Unquestionably, for weal and for woe, the 1st of January is to be the most memorable day in American annals. 4th of July was great, but the 1st of January, when we consider it all in its relations and the bearings, is incomparably greater." These are men of their times that did not know what we know and have not had the time to really look at what was put in place as opposed to what they thought was being put in place. Black people have been tricked. They've been lied to. It's no different than with the Bible. It's a great deal of black people still have not connected slavery and Christianity as it's been presented by the oppressor in this system, meaning North America, United States, in connecting those two. So even with the genius of Martin Luther King, you see how culture and how pop culture, popular narrative, his story is so dominant that as brilliant as he was a minister. He was not a historian. So many people would take Martin Luther King Jr.'s authority and continue to elevate Lincoln just because Dr. Martin Luther King said it. And if this were considered to me as a primary source, because not primary source in the way that is firsthand knowledge, but primary source meaning this is going to be one of the primary resources I'm going to use to develop my thought on Abraham Lincoln, because Dr. Martin Luther King endorsed this, I would be led in a different direction, even though a lot of his information is right. But he functions along that idea like Edna Green Medford and Alan Guelzo, that there was a change in Abraham Lincoln that made him come around to understanding and being sensitive to the situations and circumstances of people of African descent. That just was not true. But again, another great reason to get into the books of Dr. Martin Luther King, get into the books that he read. That he wrote.